Hi there, and welcome to Module 2, Gender, Organizations, and Leadership. I'm afraid this video might be a little lengthy, and the reason for that is because I'm going to be going over some really key concepts that are going to follow us through the course. So I apologize up front. The rest of the videos will not be nearly as long, I promise, and I will try to keep this to the minimum that I think is going to be helpful. So let's get going. Before we do so, three announcements actually. First, the forum for this module, as well as modules 3 and 4, will follow a different format than module 1. You'll find that in each of those three modules, 2, 3, and 4, that there will be 3 readings that are listed for each module. And in the instructions for the forum on eClass, you will find the last name of an author listed, and beside it will be the last name of the students who will be responding specifically to that reading in the forum. Sorry about that. You will skim the other 2 readings, but you'll read your assigned reading carefully for key meanings and then provide a brief discussion of the main points and your own ahas or issues of particular interest to you, followed by a question to prompt discussion by your group colleagues. And this information is in the description in the forum. I just wanted to signal it up front so that you know that the forum process or format is going to change. Second, you will notice that additional assignments begin next week in Module 3. So if you haven't already done so, please have a good look at the assignment descriptions, and if you have any questions, let me know as soon as possible. I would suggest that you think about letting the assignments kind of build on one another, particularly the second and third assignment, so that your video assignment is going to, and the work that you do in thinking about it, are going to feed into perhaps your final paper. You don't have to do that, but it might be a way to maximize your time. And that brings me to the last item. If you have any questions, you can email me and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. If necessary, we can chat via email, Skype, or phone. So don't hesitate to get in touch. Sooner rather than later is always best. All right, I always like to know something about the authors I'm reading, and I thought you might too. Of the 4 that are here, Jill Blackmore is the one that I know the very best. She's a very well-known and prolific academic who is a senior professor at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. Jill's work comes out of a historical and sociological tradition that takes into full account the political, economic, and social context that she's exploring. It's very dense. It's sometimes difficult to wade through, but nevertheless, it's always worth it as she provides insights that are rich, nuanced, insightful, and I always find very enlightening. So don't worry if you don't get everything in this paper on this round. I'll be spending more time on it in this video to outline some of the main ideas, but it will have meaning across the course, so understanding will deepen over time as well. But I've included it here because you don't have other assignments to worry about, and so the timing seemed right, even though you're just beginning the course. So for those of you who have a sociology background or a feminist studies background, you may find it not quite as challenging, but for others who don't, some of the language is going to be interesting for you. So, and if you have any questions about that, just let me know. Chris Bruner is coordinator of the Education Policy and Leadership Program in the Department of Organizational Leadership, Policy and Development at the University of Minnesota in the US. Her work is primarily looking at issues around the superintendency, an area that is underdeveloped in the literature. If you were to look it up, you would recognize that quickly. She has explored issues of power and gender and senior leadership as part of her body of work, and it has been influential in Edmund scholarship, mainly because of she's one of the few that's doing work in this area, and she does a very good job of it. The last paper is co-authored by Elizabeth Murakami, who is professor and Mike Moses Endowed Chair in Leadership at the University of North Texas, USA, and Monica Torrenson, who is associate professor and former director of studies at the Center for Principal Development at Umeå University in Sweden. Their paper is part of a co-authored research project that is part of a larger international study exploring the meaning of successful leadership. So in this much smaller piece, they're looking at 2 principles, one in Texas and one in Sweden, and issues around gender identity and what that means for successful leadership. Before we look at some of the major themes in Blackmore's paper, let's consider the definition of two key concepts that inform the theoretical stance taken by Blackmore. First, at its most fundamental, feminism is a social movement whose basic goal is equality between men and women, according to Lorber. While this may be seen to be a fairly straightforward statement, as we know from last week, as Lorber argues in her own writing, and as many authors have suggested, the concept of man and woman is complex, as is the notion of equality. In fact, within feminism, there are many different theoretical approaches to achieving equality and understanding relations between various sexual identities. So Lorber's definition is very helpful, but it will need unpacking, and Blackmore will help us to some degree with that, and on a continuing basis we'll continue to kind of unpack some of this this idea. One way to do so is to consider it through various theoretical lenses. Blackmore has chosen a critical lens, so as we read her paper we will see how she considers the basic goal of achieving equality between men and women by recognizing the ideological struggles in social systems like education systems, and considers the ways in which women and men are positioned differently within those social institutions, particularly in relations within a capitalist democratic state. And from her perspective and from the perspective of others who use critical theory and certainly critical feminist theory, the difficulty is the balance between capitalism and democracy. And what they argue is that democracy is being negated, neglected, pushed to the side in favor of the imperatives of capitalism. And so as a result, this has implications for the ways in which women and men are positioned in social institutions. She begins her paper by noting that leadership has become a central concern in both corporate governance and educational institutions in an age of increased accountability, instability, and free market capitalism. As we look at various ways in which leadership has been conceptualized, and particularly the possibilities those notions of leadership offer to students, communities, society, and contemporary organizations, what is often forgotten, or worse, ignored, by leadership gurus, we might call them, who pick up on some of the ideas from various theories of leadership and popularize them, are their provenance, that is, their roots, where they came from. That is what is often left behind. What is often left behind are the theoretical and political roots of concepts of leadership. So we're going to look at various models of leadership that have been popularized over time, like instructional leadership, transformational leadership, emotionally intelligent leadership, distributed leadership, and so on. And in particular, Blackmore asks, what do these conceptions of leadership say about social justice? How is emotional labor taken up? And how is collaboration understood in relation to governance and decision-making, for example, and various other aspects of leadership? She concludes the introduction by asking about the process of discursive appropriation talking about the process of discursive appropriation and depoliticization, and she claims that they're apparent when tracking the provenance of three key concepts in contemporary SEI discourses. And those three that she takes a careful look at are visionary, transformational leadership, distributed leadership, and what she calls the emotional term in school excellence and improvement models of leadership. And I'm going to quickly go through this. There will be a lot more detail in the paper, obviously, but just to kind of ferret out some of the key ideas. First leadership model she explores is visionary leadership's metamorphosis to transformational leadership by exploring the history of its shift over time. For those of us who lived through changes in education during the 80s and early 90s, and I remember the Harris government in Ontario, for example, the Klein revolution in Alberta, and so on. We remember well the shift from education being understood as a public good to it being understood as an individual good, as evidenced in education marketplaces like schools of choice, self-managed schools, and so on. Visionary leadership was the buzzword in which school leaders became entrepreneurial. They were expected to use things like strategic marketing to increase their market share. And in fact, this was necessary in order for the school to survive. So even if they had ideological or philosophical differences around what was happening, in order for their school to continue or for them to be able to serve the students in that school, they needed to follow the model that was being kind of forced on them through various political shifts and changes in governance. However, as some, like Sir Giovanni, noted, vision needs to be attached to a moral purpose. Vision without a moral purpose can lead to all kinds of terrible ends. And so it became a question of moral goods. Trusting relationships, he argues, were necessary, leading to new models of leadership, such as servant leadership and moral leadership. Perhaps the most influential model was transformational leadership. And this comes out of McGregor Burns, who talks about transformational and transactional leadership. And he actually originally proposed this model in the context of the civil rights movement. But theorists such as Bass, Blackmore argues, depoliticized the model, thus stripping it of its ability to do the public good. Blackmore says Bass imbued the individual leader, the visionary, the transformational leader, with greater moral virtue, and that's a good, while simultaneously depoliticizing the context. So it was all about what the leader did and had very little to do with the context in which that occurred. So, for example, a principal in a Black community that was experiencing significant poverty, that didn't matter. All that mattered was what that leader did in the school. So, and he focused on organizational objectives rather than on transforming and using education as a means for transforming wider social, economic, and political relationships. So from a feminist critical perspective, this has problems. The last two models that Blackmore explores are distributed leadership and what she calls the emotional turn in SEI, that is school excellence and improvement. She notes that distributed leadership, that is, rather than all aspects of leadership being attached to the individual, leadership is seen as resident in all players in the school and educational organization. And in that kind of a model, teamwork was core. And there is much to be said for its emphasis on collegiality, enhanced opportunities for using professional knowledge, and shared decision-making. So there's much that's good about this model. Blackmore argues, however, that this model is under further tension because it's set in a context of instrumental management that leaves little room for teacher innovation. And there's a significant amount of literature in both Canadian and the US context, and I'm sure in other contexts as well, that talks about the ways in which principals who are being given, to some degree, greater freedom to act within their schools are also constrained by wider policy environments that very strong measures of accountability and so on, that mean that it's very, very difficult to actually do the kinds of things that you see that might need to be done within the context in which you're working. The distributed leadership model has been adopted by the school effectiveness and improvement movement in concert with an emotional turn in the context of what she calls the therapeutic society, the you and me stuff, and etc. That is, and we all, of course, need to be aware of taking care of ourselves and being aware of our emotional wellness, etc., etc. But in the context of that, and in the where it has significantly enhanced importance, Blackmore argues that this has moved leadership away from relationality, centered in an emotional attachment to others and their good, to individualism and the use of emotional intelligence, etc., to manage others to achieve managerial goals. So again, that balance between the two it is, from her perspective, out of whack within this model. She also points to significant gender issues around the whole notion of emotionality that you could read about on page 145. I won't take the time for that now. Pedagogy is shaped around a highly individualized notion of learning within this model that ignores its relational aspects. It also reduces issues of equity and social justice to a weakened notion of diversity that hides or neutralizes the history and context of marginalization around race, gender, sexual orientation, class, and so on. And last, she argues that this dulling of emotions and the politics of schooling and strict measures of accountability has led to teaching being seen as technical expertise rather than opening up possibilities for societal change. So that social justice piece, from her perspective, is missing within this model. And the resulting atmosphere is one of competition rather than trust within educational organizations. It's important to note, I think, that her critique of these leadership models is not meant to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is much that's commendable. Rather, it's a critique of the emphasis within each model that limits possibilities. However, in the last part of her paper, she offers feminist alternatives that may restore those possibilities. First, however, some caveats that we need to be aware of. That feminist discourses, feminist theories, feminist ideas are never safe from appropriation, from subversion, or obliteration. And there's a historical context to suggest that. So as we're offering suggestions and alternatives, we need to be aware of how they might be taken up by others. Secondly, feminism is contested within itself. There are many feminisms. In this article, there's critical feminism, there's liberal feminism, there's a small L liberal feminism, there's post-structural feminism, there is radical feminism, there is ecofeminism, and so on and so on. There are several bodies of theoretical knowledge that tend to emphasize different kinds of aspects of that whole context that we're talking about in achieving equality among men and women. And each one of them has their place within kind of the universe of feminism. But when we say feminism, we're actually, it's a misnomer. We need to understand that there are many different perspectives on these questions, and they're all important. We also need to understand that feminists reject reductionist binaries embedded in Western theory. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in Western philosophy, in Western literature, in Western knowledge bases, in mythology and so on, we see embedded in them this kind of binary between mind-body, rationality, emotionality, public-private, objective, subjective. And when we look at these categories that are bifurcated as though they are totally separate from one another, I would just challenge you to look at them and say, okay, which would you attribute to maleness and which would you attribute to femaleness? And I think most of us would suggest that in the larger conceptual context, mind tends to be attributed to maleness, body to femaleness, rationality to maleness, and so on. So, and we all bristle when we hear that, and that's because in understanding these binaries this way, we then end up with a very essentialist understanding of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. And in doing that, we lose much about maleness and femaleness and how they're acted out or enacted in public contexts. So for feminist theory, then they have rejected those binaries and they have instead explored the richness of the other side of the binary and also located it within a kind of more a kind of both and model. So we can understand emotionality as being attached to rationality, as a particular kind of rationality, for example. So there's a rich theoretical and practical exploration of the role of emotions in educational leadership and pedagogical practice. And you can look up, for example, emotional labor, and you'll find all kinds of really interesting literature about leadership that takes this on. And most of the people who've done this kind of work are doing it from a feminist perspective. So this is something that's been offered to the field of understanding leadership that's been very helpful. So let's look at feminist alternatives. Okay. First of all, feminists have argued that educational work is political. And in doing so, they have called into question many of the practices that have been just taken as a for granted notion of how things should be done. So, for example, they have called into question the unequal power-knowledge relations in education systems. Pardon me, I've got a cold, so I apologize. Education governance. And what do we mean by that? Well, power knowledge that's a whole huge discussion that comes out of Foucault's notions of power. But what he argues in a nutshell is that knowledge is power. That would be one way of thinking about it. But there's particular ways in which certain knowledges are seen as having greater favor than others. So we see this reflected, for example, in the canon in English literature. We see it in who does science, who does history, whose histories are heard, that sort of thing. And so in challenging that then, and in thinking about education across a broader spectrum of lived experience of the world and various kinds of voices and so on, we find that education then and educational leadership becomes a site where democratic citizenship is understood and practiced in a whole different kind of way. And she talks about this in greater detail in the paper. In addition, inclusive schooling, she argues, requires inclusive leaders in a diverse organization in which democratic processes and practices and respect for diversity are central. And if that kind of leadership is available, then we can expect that we will see different kinds of things happening in schools. For example, recognition of and respect for difference are more likely to create a sense of belonging and collective well-being, so critical to an individual's sense of social inclusion, but also inclusive schooling. And this comes from Carolyn Shields, who's a scholar who for many years was at UBC. So this notion of inclusive schooling and notions of social justice comes out of this kind of alternative vision of what's possible in educational leadership. Nancy Fraser was a feminist philosopher from the US, and she reveals the poverty of a notion like diversity as she explores the much richer meaning of justice by providing a model that has room for exploring past inequalities based on the differences of class, race, and gender, etc. First, Blackmore suggests that in recognizing differences, leadership needs to respond to the particularities of context. This adds richness to organizational life, but isn't enough to produce social justice. It's a good start. Second, there needs to be a redistribution of material goods and services so that conditions are improved and barriers are lifted in order to enhance opportunities for all students and for the workers in that organization, including educational organizations. And last, there needs to be representation of diverse voices in all aspects of leadership of educational organizations. So these three, recognition, redistribution, and representation, are a model that Fraser has put forward that as a feminist, using feminist analysis, that is a much richer notion of what's possible in schools. And if we were to take these to heart in school leadership, what would school look like? So this is the alternative that Blackmore discusses in her paper. Okay, I know there's a lot to digest in this article. Take in what has meaning now, and we'll return to many of these ideas across the course. So now let's quickly consider the last two readings. I'm not going to spend nearly as much time on them. They're much more self-evident when you read them, so I don't think I need to, but I did want to point out some important understandings. Brunner, in her paper, begins by providing a very good discussion, I think, that's a nice reminder of the discussion around gender that we did in Module 1. And she talks about the social construction of gender. Having done that, she then considers how power is another social construction that is conceptualized and draws connections between constructions of gender. So gender, how does gender implicate notions of power, and how do notions of power implicate constructions of gender? How do they intersect with one another? You'll recognize some of the themes raised by Blackmore in which binaries are influential in the social construction of who can do what and how they are expected to do it. Brunner says, modern conceptions of power align in large part with particular constructions of gender, and social norms that expect congruence of power and gender have strong potential to limit access for some groups of people to roles that have been masculinized, specifically the position of superintendent of schools. So if a role is masculinized, then a woman finding her way into that space can be a very, very uncomfortable space to be in for a whole range of reasons. And here she's considering in particular power. And she looks at two conceptions of power. She talks about others, but she looks in particular at two conceptions of power. And she, to some degree, she avoids bifurcation. But she does suggest that power over is more associated with the masculine. And she compares it to some of the work of Raven and others who looked at coercive, remunerative, normative, rewards, oops, sorry about the spelling mistake, inducement, referent, expert, etc. And all imply that one person has more of something than others and can exercise power as a result of having more of that. Something that others want, obviously. Power over is gendered as masculine, but it is not a conception that every male perceived as powerful holds. So I think that's important to remember here. So in the common discourse, this is how power power over is conceptualized as masculinized, but that doesn't mean that every man enacts it in that way. But they tend to because of the kinds of socialization that are attached to that. Power with, on the other hand, is associated with the feminine. And it's more about collaborative decision-making, site-based management, authentic participation, etc. Getting things done with others. Power then is a capacity that a community of people attains when their acts of communication, cooperation, and collaboration have been successful. So this is how the people that she has interviewed for this paper talk about power. And she does find that more men talk about power in a way that it ends up being, even though they may use some of the language of power with, they end up at power over. Whereas the women tend more to think about power as power with. And you'll notice that the two women that were kind of banned from the project by those who were referring them to the researchers were women who did not fit into that model. So the implications for women tend to be more severe than they are for men. Not every man preferred power over, and not every woman enacted power with. Both men and women used mixed conceptions of power. So the question, if I were to ask it, who do you expect to see in the superintendent's office? Do you expect to see this person or this person? The statistics are pretty clear, and I've used generalities, but generally there's kind of a 70-30 split. I would say at the superintendent level, it's more like 80-20. So there's about an 80% more chance that there will be a male superintendent. If it were principal at secondary school, it's about a 70% more chance that there will be a male superintendent. And, a 20 or 30% chance or less it will be a female. However, the teaching population is constructed very differently. So the question that she raises and that she talks about in this paper is, how do conceptions of power shape opportunities and practices of female superintendents? And this is something that's raised as well by Murakami and Tron, who look at female secondary school principals. and look at, particularly at how they construct their professional identity. And they argue that using a gender perspective creates new possibilities for exploring the lives of men and women who teach, manage, and lead in education. And from their perspective as researchers into headship, they've both concluded, and in very different contexts, that educational leadership is firmly rooted in professional identity. Gender, in turn, is a crucial component of that identity. So they talk then about leadership style, professional identity and performance, development of women in leadership, and what the implications of this are for women in a position where far more men hold that position. So I'm a little over 30 minutes. I apologize for the length of this video. I hope this information has been helpful. I know I've kind of rattled through it. So I do apologize for that. Plan to be better in the next videos. But I did want to kind of lay out the landscape for you in this module so that you have an opportunity to kind of meet the ideas before you actually get into the papers. So thanks for listening. If you have any questions at all, please do let me know.